Good afternoon. Welcome back to Great Decisions. My name is Tib DeRoche. If you don't know, I've been doing this for a long time. Some of you are familiar faces. Some of you are not familiar faces, including an amazing gaggle of students from St. Mary's who came today for this. So let us applaud the youngins for wanting to be here and wanting to engage with global issues. Michelle Taylor is an awesome leader at St. Mary's, and it's great to begin to, get out into the world again and do things like this. So for those tuning in from home, as many of you know, we are both streaming this live. We have been experimenting with the hybrid brave new world of how we do this thing. We got really good with Zoom, doing 200 or so of these programs over the last couple of years. But boy howdy, making the sound work in a way that makes sense. So if you're tuning in from home and you can't hear it, I'm sure you're going to let me know. Okay. So a couple things. All of the previous programs are up on WorldOregon's YouTube channel. If you missed one, absolutely check in. This week's program will be up by next week. And we've got a few more. We're about halfway through. As I've said before, this is a really wonderful, auspicious year in a way. In 1953, we started doing programs like this. Before it was Great Decisions, it was called World Affairs Are Your Affairs. And it was actually a great film made called World Affairs Are Your Affairs, produced by the man who did the March of Time newsreels, and also produced the Animal Farm movie that was funded by the CIA. So our history runs very, very deep. Coming up next week, we have climate migration. We have a wonderful speaker from OSU, David Rathall, who I think the same thing, who is going to lead us through the issues around migration. And then as a follow-up to that, we've been doing these follow-up discussions called Diving into the Decisions, each following select programs. They have been, they could have been attended with more vigor and critical mass. I would encourage you, this is an experiment for us. We're going to be doing a program here on the campus at PSU that will get you out of your seat. It is a role play. It is a climate refugee role play where you will walk into the lives and the shoes of people who are being affected by climate and climate migration. And it is a fantastic role play that was developed by our Young Leaders in Action program and then was picked up by Rethinking Schools and is now being used by dozens and hundreds of people to try and understand through role play and empathy and all sorts of other tools what climate migration means for us both here and abroad. So if you want to do something that is a little different than sitting in a chair and nodding your head or shaking your head, I really encourage you to sign up for the climate role play that will be Wednesday, March 1st. It'll be at the Parsons Gallery, which is at the Urban Center, just over here. And it'd be great to see more of you at it. We've got room for about 25, 30 people. And we, every time we do one of these, people are blown away. It was designed for youth, but we are all young at heart. So let's just get out there and roll up our sleeves. Also coming up, we've just added this February 28th at the University Club, just down the way. We are doing the Future of Korea, US, Korea, and Oregon. We are welcoming a delegation of guests from the Korean Economic Institute, the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA, and the US Department of State, and folks from Business Oregon to look at the array of dimensions in the US-Korean relationship and Oregon's role in that. So could be a wonderful opportunity to understand what the US-Korea relationship is. There are all kinds of little factoids I could tell you, like they're our fifth trading partner. They're one of the only countries that takes Oregon blueberries from us. All the Hyundai cars in the US come through the Port of Portland, things like that. We have a rich and deep history with Korea, and I think it's a good, oh my God, I didn't know that moment. So February 28th, it's 4 p.m. There's a reception to follow. It's at the University Club where you walk in and you always feel like it's 1957. It's awesome. Anyway, also we are looking for hosts. We are doing what we call world dinners, which is a way to welcome people from around the globe into your home. You can do it with 2 people, you can do it with 18 people. You can have a barbecue, you can have a potluck, you can invite your neighbors. We've got a group coming in March 11th or 12th are the dates available. They are from 16 different African countries looking at climate change. So clearly this is on the radar right now. This is 18 visitors plus program liaisons, and they are English and French speaking. And if you're interested in hosting, Crystal Whistle is standing right back there. She is waving at you. She can tell you more. You can go to worldoregon.org and you can find out more as well. I want to remind you that because we're streaming and we're recording, when we get to Q&A, it needs to be on a mic, otherwise it will be a garbled mess. No one will hear it, and then people at home will complain to me, and you don't want that. Our speaker will give a talk. We'll go to Q&A. I will wander around the audience like Montel Williams with a mic, and you can ask your questions. Which brings us to our speaker today. I'm very excited. We have James Lin from the University of Washington. Every couple of years or so, we open up the borders and we allow people to come down from Seattle and engage with us. We had a pandemic, so we were really trying not to allow anyone from the U of W until now. And so we thought that James Lin would be a perfect way to sort of open up that on-ramp again. James Lin is a historian of Taiwan and its interactions with the world in the 20th century. His research examines international agrarian development, beginning with rural reform and agricultural science in China and Taiwan from the early 20th century through the post-war era. He is the first faculty to be hired as part of the Jackson School's new Taiwan Studies program, which is a joint project involving UW, the Taiwan government, and an anonymous private donor. And I'm very happy he can be here today to talk about a complex and ever-present issue on China and the US. James Lin.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Tim. It's an honor to be here, and thank you as well for allowing a Washingtonian to come down and to join the lovely state of Oregon. Thank you. As Tim mentioned, I am a historian of modern Taiwan and China. I also help run the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Washington. In case you're interested in learning more about Taiwan, we have all of our public programmings available, live streamed, as well as on YouTube. So today I'll talk about first US-China relations, starting historically, proceeding into the present, and we'll end with balloons. We'll talk about the so-called Taiwan issue, and we'll talk about a little bit of history of Taiwan, why it's important. We'll talk about how China and Taiwan have maybe a slightly contentious relationship, and then we'll talk about the future. So a little bit of history. Hopefully you've seen David Lampton's excellent article where he kind of discusses the history of US-China relations. So this will kind of just go over that very quickly. The story really starts in 1949 with the founding of the People's Republic of China. So this is at the end of the Chinese Revolution. The Communist Party overtakes the mainland, and Mao Zedong is the chairman of the party. He declares a new republic in 1949. From the period of 1949 onwards, the PRC's foreign policy focuses on resisting what it sees as foreign imperialism. And one of these powers that was present is the United States, which during this period supports a rival regime, which is the defeated nationalist government that retreats across the street to Taiwan. And so this is a propaganda poster that showcases Um, the soldier up at top is a Chinese PLA soldier. Down below is Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan, being supported by an American imperialist military officer. Sure thing. Ah, yes, that's better. Okay, so that changes in 1972. As we all know, Henry Kissinger negotiates with Zhou Enlai and allows for President Nixon to visit China in 1972, where here he is pictured having dinner with Zhou Enlai, meets with Mao Zedong, and basically negotiates a rapprochement between the United States and China. And this begins several decades of increasingly close relations between the United States and China. The decision to approach China in 1972 was largely defined by the United States' larger Cold War interests. So political scientists have come up with this very simple triangle that showcases what happens in this kind of triangular relationship, where the United States and the Soviet Union have a relationship that is tense in the 1970s. They're seeking to isolate the Soviet Union on the international stage. What do? They bring in the PRC as one of their allies to isolate the USSR internationally. Shortly after rapprochement, beginning in the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping comes to power in China, and he begins a period known as reform and opening up. This is 1978 is when it begins, but essentially it's a transition from China's socialist economy. I should probably take this off. From China's socialist economy to a market economy. And so this is a transition not just in terms of an economic structure, but also joining the global capitalist system at the time. And so today, China is very much integrated into the international economy. It's a key manufacturer and a key part of global supply chains. As part of this reform and opening up, Americans began to have a certain optimism for China's role in the world, beginning with roughly the 1980s. So here we have a picture of Bill Clinton meeting with Jiang Zemin, who was premier at the time, and we have a term called engagement, where American policymakers are hopeful that China can join what it sees as the liberal international order. And this is a period marked by optimism. This was maybe reaching its heights in the 2000s, when it seemed like China's economic integration into the global order would lead to its political liberalization and perhaps even the eventual democratization of China. That begins to change in 2012. Xi Jinping comes to power as he succeeds Hu Jintao, and we have a period of increased nationalism and increased authoritarian state power centered around Xi Jinping as the central leader in China. We see this in Xinjiang, which is in northwestern China, where Uyghur peoples have been designated as people of concern, have been placed into forced labor camps. And we see this in response to the Hong Kong protests that emerged as a result of Beijing attempting to more closely integrate Hong Kong into Beijing's ruling structure. And the response to the Hong Kong protests, which is a very kind of muscular, muscle-bound national security law that outlaws all sorts of treasonous activities, showcases that Xi Jinping really has an intent to increase Beijing's authority all across China and to move towards a more authoritarian form of government. This has been compounded on the US side as well. The Trump administration began a very high-profile trade war designed to kind of isolate China in certain ways, to punish them for what the United States believes to be violations of trade rules. And this has been exacerbated in recent years because of the COVID pandemic, and has led to this new term arising in US policymaking circles, this idea of strategic competition, that the United States and China are locked into a competitive relationship, no longer one of engagement. And this leads us to the present, where the matter of a balloon being blown off course, a surveillance balloon, that's true, but a balloon being blown off course has led to a rather tense series of weeks in the past month or so. Something like this, I think most China watchers would have thought to be inconceivable in years past, but it showcases how tense the relationship has become, that this matter has really blown up in international affairs. And so this brings me to what I will kind of focus on for my talk today, which is one aspect that David Lambton included in an article, which is more of my research specialty, and this is the so-called Taiwan issue. The Economist and basically every other media publication in the past year or so has remarked upon Taiwan as a potential place for the next World War. This is the cover from the May 2021 issue. Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. And late last year, August 2022, after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we indeed came very close to a military confrontation where China launched missiles very close off of inhabited territory in Taiwan. So it leads to this question that the New York Times posed: is Taiwan next? Is the next war after Ukraine going to be in the Taiwan Strait? I'll first cover the question of why Taiwan? Why does Taiwan matter? A little bit of background first. So Taiwan is the island that's highlighted here in this orange square, off the coast of mainland China, located on, from our perspective, the western Pacific Rim. Population about 23.5 million. Size in terms of land area, I always contextualize this in terms of the state of Washington. I hope this is somewhat relevant. It's about 1/4 the state of Washington. I hope that's not too different from the state of Oregon. And it's a fairly thriving economy, $48,000 per capita in terms of GDP per capita. And by all measures, in terms of different kinds of democracy indices, it's a vibrant, resilient, and quite free democracy. So it scores here 94 out of 100 in Freedom House's 2022 rankings. Now, to understand how we got here, I want to go back a little bit, once again, to a little bit of history. This will take us back several millennia. I'll start first with a breakdown of Taiwan's society. And we see here in this chart, I'll start on the right-hand side. 2% of Taiwanese people today are indigenous Taiwanese. So these have Austronesian peoples who've been present on the island of Taiwan for millennia, and they arrived or originated in Taiwan likely 2, 3, many millennia ago. There's a great deal of indigenous diversity. Each of these groups are mutually unintelligible languages, so they're independent kind of communities or tribes, if you want to use that term. And there's a great deal of richness and diversity in that community. The next is this left-hand side. So 98% of people who are in Taiwan today can be considered, ethnically speaking, Han Chinese, because they originated from mainland China at some point. This first row here, Hakka and Hoklo, these are people who traced their migration from mainland China back to the Ming Dynasty. So we're talking about 400 or so years ago that they began to come. This really it began under European influence as well. So Chinese had been coming to Taiwan in very small numbers prior to Dutch colonization, but the Dutch arrived in Taiwan and they established a small colony in the south of Taiwan near present-day Tainan. And they really set up a regime that encouraged Chinese laborers to migrate to Taiwan and to till agricultural lands. And so this was what one scholar calls co-colonization, because the Dutch, as well as Chinese migrants, moved to the island of Taiwan. After the Dutch, there were a series of other European powers that colonized Taiwan. So the Spanish, Zheng Zhenggong is half Chinese. He's called a pirate king, but really a better term is kind of an entrepreneur. So he sets up an entrepreneurial state in Taiwan for a short period. Then the Qing dynasty, the Qing Empire, kicks out Zheng Zhenggong and takes over Taiwan as a frontier territory. Then it's handed over to the Japanese at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. And then finally, which I'll talk about in just a second, is the era of the nationalist rule. So going back to this breakdown, this very bottom category is called mainlander, 13%. These are Chinese who migrated very recently to Taiwan, so with the nationalist government between 1945 and roughly 1949. And this is the period that I'll focus on because it's the most relevant to understanding Taiwan's current predicament. The Republic of China was the government that ruled China from 1911 onward, or actually 1912, I guess technically. The Qing dynasty falls during the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. During the period of the Republic of China, there's a great deal of kind of political upheaval. Really, the Republic of China government is stable for only about a decade or so, 1937 to about 1927, 1937. The invasion of the Japanese into China is what really threw things off. And the end of World War II in 1945 ended the Japanese invasion, but it was followed immediately by a civil war between the nationalist government and the communists, which had gained a great deal of power during the Civil War. Now, the nationalists, as we know, eventually lose. So Chiang Kai-shek takes his military forces and he decides that he wants to find a place where he can regroup and ideally counterattack to defeat the communists at a future point after he's built up a significant amount of power. He chooses the island of Taiwan, and this is because of its advantageous geographic position. It's located about 100 miles off the coast of China. It's fairly well protected by the Taiwan Strait. And there, Chiang Kai-shek takes basically his entire government, all of his bureaucrats, his military. He even takes all the gold reserves from the central bank and the treasures from the National Palace Museum to Taiwan. And he sets up a government in exile, centered in Taipei. On Taiwan, the nationalist government becomes enmeshed within this growing global Cold War. The Korean War is what really changes things. It's the watershed moment where the United States begins to realize that communism is a global threat, and it's a threat to American interests, and it's a threat to the American way of life from the manner of Cold War thinking. So what happens is the nationalist government, as an anti-communist regime, becomes a natural ally of the United States. The United States begins a patron-client relationship with the nationalist government that persists for decades, and really, one can argue, persists into the present. In Taiwan, the nationalist government continues to see itself as a Chinese regime. It doesn't really matter that it's no longer in Beijing, it's no longer even in the mainland. It nonetheless argues that it is the rightful regime that rules all of China. And so it begins a process of Sinicization, teaching Taiwanese people who at that point had been under so many different colonial rulers that their, I guess, Chineseness had been beginning to wane a bit. And so they began to instruct them once again that they were in fact Chinese. And so there were cultural programs of Sinicization, so teaching Beijing opera, for example. Mandarin becomes the mandatory language of instruction, the mandatory language of government and of society. And that's an imposed language because the local language is not Mandarin. In classrooms, the nationalist government dictates that teachers will teach 5,000 years of Chinese history and not Taiwanese history. And this is all backed up by a political system under nationalist rule that was one of martial law. So the military backed up political rule and in fact suspended all of the different civil liberties that were guaranteed under the ROC Constitution. And so this was a period of authoritarianism. People who spoke up against the repressive political environment were often detained, secretly tried, sometimes jailed for decades, or sometimes just directly executed. And this persisted for about 40 years, from 1947 roughly until the mid-1980s or so, when a rising democracy movement in Taiwan began to push the government to liberalize And over the course of 10 years, from the mid-1980s until the 1990s, Taiwan underwent a drastic transformation from a one-party authoritarian state into a full-fledged democracy. So there was liberalization, freedom of press, free elections beginning at the local levels, going up to the legislative levels, and then finally up to the presidential level in 1996. As part of this democratization, Taiwan also went a process of decolonization, meaning that they began to address the 40 years of authoritarian rule under the nationalist government and the effect that that had upon Taiwan society and culture. As a result, we began to see something emerge, which was a Taiwan-centric identity. This idea that Taiwanese people, because they had been undergoing a very different history from people in mainland China, that they began to see themselves as not Chinese, but rather as Taiwanese. And so this is backed up by polling. I think this really demonstrates what we can understand to be a historical phenomenon that occurs simultaneously with democratization and decolonization. So this is a poll that's been conducted on an annual basis by Taiwan's National Zhenzi University's Election Study Center. This green line, oh, I should explain what the poll asks. It asks a very simple question. Do you identify as, or are you Taiwanese or are you Chinese? This green line shows people who identify as Taiwanese and only as Taiwanese. And if you look on the left-hand side, this survey begins in 1992. That number, in 1992, there are only about 18% of people in Taiwan who identified as Taiwanese and only as Taiwanese. And now if you look on the right-hand side, at the end of 2022, when this was last conducted, that number is now at 61%, so that is now a solid majority. If you look at people who identify as Chinese and only as Chinese, that used to be a quarter of the population, 25% in 1992, and today is, I have to see that number, 2.7%. It's a very small number. And you see this in terms of how Taiwanese people express their politics. The Sunflower Movement was a student movement now almost a decade ago that was in response to, then it was the Kuomintang, the nationalist party. So the nationalist government had fully transitioned to become actually a democratic party that functions in a fully free electoral system that had opposed the nationalist efforts to bring legislation and to pass legislation that would increase economic and political ties with Beijing, with China. Students saw the way in which it was done, which legislators attempted to push this through the Legislative Yuan, which is the parliamentary body, without the necessary political review. They saw this as attempting to bypass Taiwan's democratic institutions. And so students came out in force. They occupied the Legislative Yuan and forced the legislators to step back, to reverse course, and to pull out that legislation. So it was never passed. And so this is what scholars have argued is kind of the basis of the difference between the politics of Taiwan and China today. So this is from Shirley Lin, who's written an excellent book about cross-strait relations. She argues, over time, Taiwanese have come to regard Taiwan as the community whose interests should be promoted, and more have come to view China as the other that challenges those interests. And so you see there's a perception that China is a different community and one that actually challenges the interests of Taiwan. So I'll move on here to the relationship now between Beijing and Taipei, between Taiwan and China. Why does Taiwan matter for Beijing? One aspect is the one that David Lambton puts a lot of emphasis into, and this is the kind of geopolitical perspective that Taiwan occupies a key strategic geographic position. This map shows what US policy planners call the first island chain, which is the chain of US allies and military bases that kind of contains or encircles the eastern and southern kind of seaboard of mainland China. So this is Japan up north, going down into the Okinawan or Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan right in the middle, going down to the Philippines, which is now once again kind of resuming a very positive relationship with the United States, around the South China Sea. And And the second island chain includes, Guam and a number of U.S.-controlled islands. So you can see that Taiwan occupies a very key and central location right in the middle of that first island chain. It kind of poses an issue for Chinese desires to establish that, what Lambton calls that buffer zone that great powers hope to establish around their own territories and offers them a sense of security. There's also this idea of a historical narrative of what's called reunification. So here is Xi Jinping in October 2021 discussing, and this kind of line is something that Chinese leaders have said for decades, so this is nothing new. No one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, and strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. So you see here a few key terms: national sovereignty, territorial integrity, complete reunification of the motherland. This is all referring to Taiwan. From the Chinese perspective, Taiwan is Chinese territory. It is Chinese territory that has been separated due to Western imperialism because of, first it was the Dutch, and then the Spanish, the Japanese, and then finally American imperialism that had kept the nationalists outside of Beijing's control. And it also mirrors what other scholars have argued, which is that under Xi Jinping, nationalism has become increasingly important as a tool of state legitimacy. If we were to go back to that triangle that I mentioned earlier in 1972, between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, we can actually replace the Soviet Union with Taiwan today and understand this relationship quite well. We're in a period where the relationship between the United States and China is one that is particularly weak. And so what we're going to see is a corresponding effect on the other legs of the triangle, which is that the relationship between the US and Taiwan is now historically quite strong, probably the strongest it's been in decades. And the relationship between China and Taiwan is also very tense. Again, from the Chinese perspective, they see the United States as an interloper. So this is a political cartoon from the Global Times, again, October 2021. And this is a very common perspective. If you speak to Chinese politicians, Chinese policymakers, they see Taiwan as being used as a pawn in the great power politics of the United States. And so you get to understand Beijing's perspective in all of this. Okay, what is Taiwan's position today? So the current president is President Tsai Ing-wen. She is a member of the Democratic Progressive Party. So this is the party that emerged out of democratization in the 1980s. They had their roots in a pretty tough kind of democracy activism that many of their founding members saw a great deal of jail time, a great deal of persecution under the authoritarian period. She's now nearing the end of her second term. Tsai Ing-wen is a president that Beijing does not really like. They don't like the DPP, and they see the DPP as asserting Taiwanese sovereignty and as opposing Beijing's desire to build closer relationships with Taiwan. On the other hand, the opposition party currently is the Kuomintang. This is the same party that used to be the one-party state, the nationalist government that used to run Taiwan for about 4 decades or so. Now that they've transitioned to a political party, so they're no longer this authoritarian government, their foreign policy is, especially with regards to cross-strait relations, so with regards to how we should approach our relationship with Beijing, has been one of China is the 2,000-pound gorilla that's just our neighbors across the strait. And the sensible foreign policy for us to pursue is one of friendship. You don't need a strong defense if you're on friendly relations with the very dangerous gorilla across the strait. And so their foreign policy is one of increasing relations with Beijing, pursuing friendly relationships, pursuing closer economic and political ties. And so you have 2 very different philosophies where the KMT seeks to have a closer relationship. The DPP is skeptical, it's wary of Beijing, and it seeks to increase Taiwan's sovereignty without necessarily pushing Beijing too far. So they're careful to follow this middle road of pursuing sovereignty, but not to the extreme end. In terms of how Taiwanese people see this as well, so once again, this is by the same National Zhenzi University Election Study Center. The other big survey they ask is, what is your preference in terms of cross-strait relations? And there are a few different options here. They basically come down to Taiwan should unify with China, either immediately or some point in the future. Taiwan should maintain the status quo indefinitely, so this kind of nebulous position where it doesn't really have so-called formal independence, and some sort of independence-leaning spectrum. So Taiwan should declare formal independence, so meaning they should change their official name to something like the Republic of Taiwan, or maintain the status quo and, you know, declare independence at some point in the far future. There's lots of colored lines here, but I just want to point out that the most important part that we want to pay attention to is that the predominant position is maintaining the status quo. So if you combine the black line, the blue line, and the green lines together, these are all maintain status quo for the near future or indefinitely. And so most times people want to maintain the status quo. They don't want to take any kind of extreme action. And I also want to point out that unification is, as soon as possible, is 1.2%. Unification at some future point is something like 6%. So unification is not very popular in Taiwan. Most Taiwanese people do not want to have anything to do with China. Okay, so I'll move into this last portion where I will offer some thoughts about what we can expect to see, what we should think about, what we should pay attention to as we think about the future. One is defense, which of course is very important, especially now that, you know, in light of the Ukraine war. For the longest time, Taiwan thought that, and I think many Taiwanese people still believe today, that war is still unlikely. And I think that there is good reason to see that Taiwan's situation is different from Ukraine's situation. But nonetheless, I think the Ukraine war has really changed a number of perspectives in Taiwan, and we're going to see some changes as a result of that. So one is that the military in Taiwan is not a popular institution. This is because of its history being wrapped up in martial law. You know, the military is what was enforcing a very authoritarian kind of political regime. For the past 2 decades or so, Taiwan has been moving away from, currently there's a compulsory military service for males, young males, and they've been trying to move away from that. Very recently, they've reversed course. So they've said that we are going to actually not push for a completely volunteer military force. We're going to move back to, I think it's a 1-year commitment now that they're going to move back to. David Lambton in this article highlighted the importance of the Taiwan Relations Act. So that I think it was a couple sentences. The Taiwan Relations Act defines the US relationship with Taiwan in terms of law. 1979, this was passed. It says the United States is obligated to sell military weapons to Taiwan. It's not obligated to the defense of Taiwan. And so the result is that we have, I think, continued pressure from the United States for Taiwan to continue to purchase military arms, which for the longest time, Taiwan had been fairly reluctant to purchase too much. And in recent years, Taiwan, or I should say in recent months, the Taiwan administration has begun to increase defense spending and an agreement to purchase increasingly more US arms. So they're attempting to address many years of relative defense spending shortfalls. And finally, there is this poll that was conducted by a few political scientists a few months ago, which shows a shift in social perspectives about Taiwan's military. It used to be, as I mentioned, Taiwan's military used to be seen as very unpopular, and now people are beginning to think that we need to reinvest in the military. Oh, so this is what I mentioned, there's the increase in defense spending. On the US side, there also have been increased desires, especially among Congress, which is very pro-Taiwan, to do more for Taiwan. And so there is the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022, which I believe it might have made it out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but didn't make it onto the Senate floor. But what happened instead was that the provisions of the Taiwan Policy Act, which would have made for, which would have allowed for the United States to sell a larger variety of arms, including arms that are offensive in nature, to Taiwan, was instead integrated into the annual defense bill that passed at the end of last year. So many of those provisions are now a part of the defense authorization bill, so they are now law. As I mentioned, Congress is very pro-Taiwan. This is the vote outcome of the Taipei Act, which directed the State Department to help international allies that recognize Taiwan. I don't know the last time I saw a 415-0 vote. Might have been a while ago, but you know, Taiwan, very popular bipartisan issue. Okay, this is the last thing I'll talk about in terms of thinking about the future, which is strategic ambiguity. Lambton didn't talk about this. He talked about One China, which is kind of related. I'll mention very briefly, the One China policy is that this is what came out of the 1972 negotiations between Nixon and Mao and Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, which is that the United States recognizes that there is only one China and that it acknowledges Beijing's position that Beijing believes Taiwan is a part of China. It doesn't take a position really on Taiwan's status, it just acknowledges the Beijing's position. And this is the One China policy as well as strategic ambiguity are both purposefully ambiguous. So here I'll talk about strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is this idea that the United States does not clearly state whether it will defend Taiwan in the case of any kind of Chinese military action. And so it provides what political scientists have called dual deterrence. It deters Beijing from taking unilateral military action, for example, to unify Taiwan by force, by invading, or there's a range of different military possibilities. And it also deters Taiwan from taking drastic action, political action, that would cross Beijing's red line. In other words, that would really push Beijing to, force Beijing to act. And so the idea is that this ambiguity from the United States is actually something that maintains flexibility and allows for a durable status quo to persist, decades into the future. And strategic ambiguity has worked fairly well. It's maintained peace in the Taiwan Strait for about 5 decades, ever since it was kind of informally rolled out as policy in the 1970s. Now, in recent years, because of the worsening US-China relationship, because of how Taiwan has become more prevalent in headlines, that we're beginning to see from some places, there's an increased call to move away from strategic ambiguity and move toward what they call strategic clarity, which is clarifying that the United States will defend Taiwan in the instance of a military invasion. This early on came from Richard Haass and David Sachs. Richard Haass is the president of the Council for Foreign Relations. He is an influential and well-respected political scientist. There are others who are more cautious about this. So this is a report from also the Council of Foreign Relations that cautions that strategic ambiguity has been very successful for a reason. But nonetheless, the call to move towards strategic clarity has reverberated across DC, across think tanks, and across Congress. There are lawmakers, congressmen, senators who have very publicly said that the United States should offer a clear commitment to defend Taiwan. President Biden himself has said on multiple public occasions that the United States will defend Taiwan. And this is a departure from strategic ambiguity. And it's also strange because when he says this in public, the White House press office comes, like a day later and says that United States policy of strategic ambiguity has not changed. And so there's been a lot of commentary about whether strategic ambiguity is being purposefully ambiguous, or is President Biden's unambiguity actually ambiguous? So there's lots of things that you can begin to combine adjectives together. It's not clear to me that Biden's public comments, even though he's made them multiple times now, and most recently on 60 Minutes, which is a very official platform, there's no doubt that's not a slip up or kind of Biden going off script. This is a very purposeful, and this was done in advance. It wasn't off the cuff. So there's still some discussion about what this means. Is Biden issuing public comments to some degree, but also having the State Department say, no, not quite, as a form of like something between clarity and ambiguity? It's not clear. Nonetheless, I think that this is something that we should keep an eye out for. And that is the end. So thank you very much.
James, thank you so much. So now it's the Q&A portion. I see a hand over here. It'll take me a little bit to walk over there, so I'm going to ask the first question, and then we will walk over to you. Reminder that questions are 30 seconds or less. They have a question mark at the end. And it's great because we have so many people in the room to not try and do, sort of a redirect on your question, but take turns. It's a very lovely thing. So I couldn't help but think with the rhetoric around the reunification of the motherland, the echoes of what has been happening in Ukraine, and thinking about this idea of historic, imagined or otherwise, right to territories. How has the Ukraine situation ratcheted up that rhetoric both in China and for the Taiwanese? Because certainly right after Ukraine was invaded, people said, well, golly gee, is Taiwan next?
Okay. Should I close this or pull it? Oh, pull out the cable. Yeah, we don't need that anymore. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good question. So, we recently had an event at UW that was discussing, the consequences of the Ukraine war on the Taiwan Strait, relations between U.S., Taiwan, and China. And one thing to keep in mind is that the narrative of unification that comes out of Beijing has been consistent since, more or less since 1949, ever since Taiwan became the place where there's a rival regime, that the nationalist government is there. They're the ones that are saying the communists are illegitimate. Since then, they've said that unification has been one of our political goals. In practice, though, it seems like sometimes this is more narrative than actual kind of military desire. There have been declassified documents from the 1950s that have indicated that Mao Zedong actually didn't really see invasion of Taiwan as a realistic possibility, and he was constrained by the limited capabilities of the PLA back then. But I think it also showcases that the Taiwan issue remains as much a political issue as anything else. And at some points in China's history, it's actually proven to be a useful kind of distraction, that saber rattling, that demonstrating that Beijing is concerned about China's reputation, is concerned about China's national integrity. These kinds of things are easy ways to drum up public support and to ensure that Chinese people continue to support the regime in Beijing. And so it's not too clear exactly whether Beijing's perspective now after the Ukraine war has really changed too much. I think that there's still this long-term inertia, this long-term continuity. They haven't changed their position in terms of their narrative or their rhetoric. And in terms of what kind of unification benefits to Beijing, I don't think that's changed too much either, and in fact may have gone slightly in the opposite direction, that the cost might have risen since the Ukraine war. So hopefully that helps answer.
Dr. Lin, I'm a retired naval officer, and I see a lot in the media about weapon systems we provide to Ukraine and other systems they're asking for, but I see very little about what we provide to Taiwan and what they want. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that and what the Chinese would do in reaction to systems we give to Taiwan.
Yeah, that's a good question. The Taiwan Relations Act, as I mentioned, obligates the United States to sell arms of defensive nature to Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, for decades, has seen military sales not just purely as in terms of what we would consider to be like strategic capability. It's also a political symbol of U.S.-Taiwan friendship. And the military is a political symbol as well. And so many of these purchases in the past have focused on large ticket items, things like F-16 fighters. And these are things that most American defense experts that I've read and I've spoken to think are not really the best use of Taiwan's defense spending. The basic idea is that Taiwan needs to pursue a porcupine strategy. It needs to make itself extremely costly to invade, and it needs to rely upon asymmetric forms of warfare that are cheap to invest in, but cause great deals of, or a great amount of harm and would make an invader hesitate to invade Taiwan. And so these are things like, I believe, area of denial kinds of weapons, and weapons that would be relatively low cost in nature. So I think that there's still kind of a slight disparity between different parties involved. I think that there are those who are really concerned about military strategy who say that, the porcupine strategy is one that makes most sense, and I think that's correct. Then there are more politically involved folks involved, whether that's in Congress, which I think some folks who have, ties to the defense industry also have incentive to sell certain kinds of weapons to Taiwan. And in Taiwan, that large defense items have symbolic value. And some American experts have asked Taiwan to move away from that, instead to pursue a porcupine strategy.
Hi there. I worked for the state of Oregon's International Trade Division years back. And in this strategic ambiguity to clarity, how has states' rights to have official relations with Taiwan versus federal having official relations Taiwan helped in clarity and our connections, or has it caused more problems with China?
That's an interesting question. So strategic clarity refers just to military obligations, so the obligation to defend Taiwan. But the question of kind of diplomatic relationships, even if it's done at below the federal level, still concerns Beijing, because then that addresses the one China issue, which is that the United States only recognizes the regime in Beijing. So that's the official China that the United States recognizes. Taiwan does not have official diplomatic relationships with, or official diplomatic relations with the United States. So that's why, for example, the Taiwanese de facto consulate or embassy is titled the Taipei Economic Cultural Office. And there are all sorts of names that are used to get around the fact that the United States and Taiwan do not have a formal diplomatic relationship. I think that the relationships below the federal level are not, I believe they're not covered in the Taiwan Relations Act, which does cover, the official state-to-state relationship. And so it's one of the ways in which I think Taiwan and the United States operate around this very formal obstacle. Yeah. And, I don't have a lot of insight into particular state government interactions. I don't know how much really gets done. I think it is mostly centered around like business and trade, which of course naturally makes sense. But I think that's something that Taiwan understands is a valuable conduit for conducting relations. And it's one that is legally kind of allowed by the TRA. And it's one that largely flies under Beijing's radar. I think that, Beijing really cares about state-to-state relations. I mean, when I say state, I mean like nation-state, nation-to-nation relations, country-to-country relations. They don't care too much about states like Oregon or Washington or California. And so I think this is one of the ways in which like the actual practice of diplomacy works around some of the legal barriers.
Hi, I'm a junior from St. Mary's. And my question is sort of like, do you think that this idea of like unambiguous American support is sort of like insidiously even more dangerous for this issue and increasing tensions just because it doesn't take a clear side? Or if it is our safest option, what do you think are going to be the consequences if we explicitly, formally declare a side with either Taiwan or China in terms of immediate consequences or long-term impacts?
I can kind of lay out the thinking about both sides of the argument. So those who are in favor of strategic ambiguity argue that ambiguity gives the United States a great amount of flexibility in how it reacts to any particular situation. It offers enough deterrence to Beijing that if they're unsure about what the United States will do, that serves to make them hesitate enough that they will not take any kind of action to disrupt peace in the Taiwan Strait. Folks who say that we should move to strategic clarity to make things unambiguous are arguing that there have been changes in Beijing, that Beijing is increasingly aggressive, that it increasingly does not care about international norms. It's increasingly willing to challenge the United States as a global power. And that this existing policy of ambiguity is not enough of a deterrent if China continues on this path of increasing hostility. And so they're saying that the only thing that will really offer the most deterrence to Beijing is a clear signal that the United States will intervene in the instance of a military invasion. And so I think that the debate is still quite open. I think that the main issue here is that we don't have a lot of insight into Beijing's political kind of motives. We have some insight. We can obviously see a lot of things publicly through speeches, through actions in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, etc. But because of how the Chinese political structure is really centered at the top, and how there's there isn't a lot of transparency for outside observers to understand what's going on in the very, very top of the political echelon in Beijing. So there's still a lot of speculation about what would be best. And I think this is the heart of the issue, that so many American policymakers are not too sure exactly about what Beijing's actual, what would they actually do. And so people who fall on either side of this spectrum, I think, have different perspectives. They have different ideas about what Beijing's true motivations are. In terms of short, long-term consequences, I think that my sense is that strategic ambiguity will continue. I don't see that changing, even though Biden has kind of moved to situate that a little bit closer to clarity, but not really. I don't really see a large-scale change at the moment. And I think if there were going to be a change to strategic ambiguity, it'd be very big news, and a lot of people will be talking about it.
Hello. In, I guess, introduction, right? So spent significant amount of time living in that part of the world. In recent years, China has established a growing force of naval force, and that puts two strong naval forces in the same part of the world. And I'm wondering what you see as happening as a result of that going forward.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I should provide a disclaimer. I'm not a defense expert, so this is kind of based on what I'm understanding. For the longest time, China's military capabilities were limited. An invasion of Taiwan it continues to be very difficult because of the fact that to accomplish an amphibious landing, you have to have amphibious capable ships. You have to be able to cross the strait, get through all of those anti-amphibious landing defenses, and then you have to find a suitable landing spot, of which there are not many in Taiwan. Now that the PLA has built up a significant navy, amphibious landing becomes more and more possible, and that changes the calculus for Taiwan and for the United States. One more thing is that, as we've seen in the Ukraine conflict, there is a growing spectrum of what can be conceived as warfare. There's conventional warfare, and then there's what's called gray zone warfare, this spectrum between full-out war and something that's not full-out war. And one of them is the possibility of enacting a blockade of Taiwan, which would really be detrimental for Taiwan. Taiwan is deeply integrated into the global economy. Its supply chains in semiconductors, for example, TSMC supplies over 50% of the world's advanced semiconductors. And that would be detrimental not just for global supply chains, it'd be detrimental for Taiwanese society, which depends on imports of everything from food to energy. And so a blockade, which would be capable now under PLA Navy capabilities, would be a potential option for Beijing to pursue in case it wishes to, take some sort of military action. And a blockade would be difficult to break because of how powerful the PLA Navy is. And so this is one of those things that now is changing in scenario planning.
Now, I wanted to ask a question that comes to the issue of Beijing's views on some of these things. It's not just a question of China versus the US, but it's a question of individual sovereignty for individual countries. And I think it may be the case that the history of China, which was for so long their sovereignty was completely ignored by the colonial powers, that's led them to simply reject the whole notion of sovereignty. If you can comment on that and whether it makes any sense.
Yes. This is an interesting question because, for centuries, starting with the first Opium War, when the British came and they forced a number of unequal treaties upon the Qing government. So they forced extraterritoriality. Foreigners who were in the Qing Empire were not subject to Chinese laws. Treaty ports were opened up where the China Maritime Customs could not impose what they wanted to impose in terms of tariffs and taxes. They had to follow what the British said. And this was followed by about 100 years of kind of influence of different Western powers in China. And this is a historical narrative that is very much in the political narrative of how the Chinese Communist Party sees itself as legitimating its rule, that it stands up to Western powers, and has defined its contemporary political view in the international system. So China within the United Nations, for example, has always maintained since probably 1949 that the thing of utmost importance to it is this idea of sovereignty, that countries should not intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries. And this has been to the benefit of China since 1949 because it perceived, for example, Tibet, it says, is a domestic issue, do not interfere. Xinjiang is a domestic issue, do not interfere. Hong Kong is a domestic issue, do not interfere. Taiwan is a domestic issue, do not interfere. And so it's really benefited its own politics by pursuing this line. Very interestingly, this has changed in the past year because when Russia invaded Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation recognized as such in the United Nations and by all of the nations in the world, when this has happened in the past, when the United States invaded Iraq, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, China is the first to stand up in the Security Council and said this is a gross violation of sovereignty and principles. But China was silent when Russia invaded Ukraine, and it issued, in fact, a statement of friendship between Xi Jinping and Putin. And this is the first time that it's done so since 1949, I believe, which I think indicates also for some watchers, I think, concern that, a political position that has been maintained by Beijing for such a long period of time and is beneficial to its own international politics was not pursued in this instance. And so it tells us that, they really value that friendship with Russia and that perhaps maybe other forms of politics are taking priority.
So we're coming down to time. I've got a question online from one of our streaming at home viewers. Do you think China would risk the economic cost of a major war which might involve the US for such a small territorial gain and huge economic losses?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question. So this is the question that I think everybody is really, trying to figure out from Beijing. We don't know because we have such little to go on. It's so difficult to understand. At Xi Jinping and maybe like the standing committee of the Politburo, what exactly is their perspective on this matter? Personally, I think that there are significant costs to any kind of military action. Economic costs, absolutely. From the Ukraine war, you've seen that the rest of the world is willing to use drastic economic measures to punish aggressor nations. And in ways that I think Beijing probably would not have predicted prior to the invasion, that Russia was frozen out of international financial systems, its assets were frozen, its foreign reserves were frozen, and essentially is forced to trade with only a few number of nations that are willing to do that politically, so with China, with India. This would be extremely costly for China because China is much more integrated into the global economy than Russia is, and it doesn't have the benefit of natural gas and oil that it can export to make up for that loss. So the cost would be very significant. The benefits, I think, is the real key here. Like, do you see that some sort of military action benefits Beijing? And I don't really see too much benefit in it. So, if I were in charge in Beijing, that's not something I would do, but I'm not in charge. I think that there's the question of geostrategic importance that even though it's such a small territory, it occupies a very key place in terms of that geographic position. And then there's the other, which is that, it is an important part of Beijing's political narrative, and it's an important part of their political legitimacy, that they see themselves as really staking their reputation on bringing China back as a global power, kind of addressing the wrongs of its imperial past, and asserting that China's power should not be, they will not stand by as Western powers interfere with what they perceive as their domestic matters.
Okay, I want to say thank you to Professor Lin. Give him a big hand.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much for a very, very nuanced viewpoint on an issue that tends to get broken down into an us and them issue, and I think being able to understand the wedge issues and some of the fine print below the fold and below the headline is really super helpful, and that's exactly what Great Decisions is supposed to be about, which is getting us involved in the discussions. And I'm also glad that your son could be here with us today.
Yeah, he's pretty vocal. He also wants to speak up.
Thank you all for being here. We will see you next week.